Hi, welcome to another tutorial with Snowy Days Quilting. I'm Bobby, and today I'm going to walk you through how to paper piece the flames for my Quilting by Candlelight block. The first thing you need to do is print the pattern page that has the flame templates on it. Make sure that you're printing that at 100% scale or actual size. The exact wording for your printer may vary, but it's important to make sure that you're printed at 100% scale. To be sure that happened, I have a 1-inch test square here, so I'm simply going to take a ruler and look at one of my 1-inch blocks and make sure that it lines up correctly with my test square. If it does, I know that I'm good to go. Once I'm sure that I've printed correctly, I'll cut out a flame. And I also like to cut these margins a little bit so that I'm pretty even all the way around the block. I just find that makes it a little bit easier to place my pieces later. And the very first thing that I like to do when I'm getting ready to paper piece is pre-fold all of my seams. So I'm just going to come around every single seam that I'm going to sew and fold it. This is just a standard bookmark. And I removed the tassel up here so it lies nice and flat. I'm just going to work my way around. All I'm doing is lining up the bookmark with my sew lines and then using that to make sure I get a nice crisp fold. And I'm going around every single line. All right, last one. Now that these are folded, they will be much easier to work with later, and they're also going to make it really easy to line up my first piece. So I'll flip this over. Well, first, my very first piece is A1, which is my flame fabric. And when I flip this over, I'm going to look at all of these creases where my flame goes. And that might be a little bit hard to see on video, so I'm just going to quickly sketch where those fold lines are so that you can actually see them. All right, so you can see, based on my folds, exactly where my flame needs to go. For this first piece, I'm going to take a standard school glue stick and just put a little dab of glue in the middle. That really helps hold the first piece in place when I don't have any seams in my paper yet. And then I'm going to take my flame right sides up and just center it over those fold lines. Give it a little bit of a press with my fingers, and if I wanted to, I could hold this up to a light and I would be able to see the shadow of my fabric through to just be doubly sure that everything is nicely covered. Now, I want to get ready to sew my very first seam, which is going to be this seam between A1 and B1. So it switches letters because it's a different fabric. The B's are for my backgrounds, and I just want to sew that first seam. In order to make that easy, I'm going to take my bookmark again and fold this, and I will use my add a quarter ruler. That will just sit nicely on top of the bookmark because it has a lip here on the back, and that lip will snug right up, and with my rotary cutter I will cut with the ruler, and that gives me a nice 1/4 inch seam away from this line so that I know right where to line up my next piece. So I will take my first piece and just line it up along that line that I just cut. So if I wanted to, I could take a finger right here at this intersection and a finger right here at this intersection to pinch, and my thumbs are now in the same spot because I'm pinching my thumbs together with my fingertips, and I can see that I have plenty of extra fabric on either side. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, flip it so that I can see my lines, and I want to sew right along this line right here. When I do that, I want to be sure that I go at least a 1/4 inch past the line on either direction so that my seam includes the seam allowance. So I'll take that to my sewing machine and sew, and you can see that my thread goes a little bit past on either side. The other thing that I did is I backstitched at the beginning and end of that seam. And now I can just press this over. Give it a good press, and my first piece is done. My next piece, we'll get this right side up, my next piece is B2. So B1 was my first seam, B2 is my second seam. We're just going to go around in order of the numbers. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'll take my bookmark, fold this over, use my add a quarter ruler to trim so that it's nice and easy to line up my next piece. So my next piece will go along my trimmed line, right sides together. I'll line that up, take it to my sewing machine, and sew along B2. All right, so I have that done. Once again, you can see that I started and ended past the actual sew line. Something that might help if you're new to paper piecing is to actually take a pen and extend those lines so you don't have to eyeball them. I tend to eyeball them. Once you've gotten a little bit of practice, that's pretty easy to do. So once again, I sewed that, it's ready to go. I'm going to press to one side. So now I've sewn B1 and B2, my two side pieces. That means B3 is next. And here we get to why I backstitch at the beginning and end of my seams. Because in order to fold along this line, I actually need to tear the paper away from this seam. So I'm just going to very gently tug apart the paper and the fabric until I get to be able to fold my B3 seam line. And by back stitching on those threads on my previous seam, that made it really easy to tear the paper without accidentally pulling out any stitches. So same process, I folded the B3 line and used my add a quarter ruler to prepare myself for my next seam. And then I fold over my paper, and I know right away where I want to place my next piece because it's going to be that nice straight edge that I just cut. So right sides together once again, and just make sure that this piece is going to be going past my 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side. And the cut sizes are pretty generous, so that's not going to be a challenge. You don't need to worry too much about getting it lined up. In this case, I just hung it over my paper a little bit on either side, and I know that's going to give me more than enough room. So I'll go back to my sewing machine and sew B3. In this case, I want to be extra careful with my seam line to make sure that it goes all the way past this dotted line on the outside, because that's going to be my seam allowance around the final flame, and I need to make sure that where I sew secures the fabric all the way to the edge. So I'll go ahead and sew that. And I have that done. Piece 3, once again, back stitch on either side of my B3 seam. And I will press that. I'm going to go ahead and walk you through all of the pieces, although at this point you can guess that it's going to be very much the same process. So now I just did 3, so I want to do 4, and I'm going to pull these stitches away so I can get to fold, and I'll do that down here also just a little bit so that I can fully fold along that B4 line. Okay, so B4, I've cut my seam allowance. I'm going to take my next piece, right sides together, line it up, same idea. I'm going to make sure that this is hanging off either side of my paper just a tiny bit, and go to my sewing machine, and this time I'm going to be sewing along B4. Once again, I'm going to be very careful to make sure that my seam goes past my 1/4 inch seam allowance that's marked around the flame. So my line gets extended a little bit. If you want to actually extend that for yourself to see rather than eyeballing it, you can use your straight edge and a pen so that it's very easy to stitch all the way along. All right, so I have stitched all the way across my B4 past my seam allowance, back stitched on both ends. Press this. So we just did 4. That means the next number is 5. So I'm going to tear these stitches just a little bit away from my paper in both of those spots so I can fold my B5 line, trim away the excess so I have a nice easy spot to line up my next piece. And I will do right sides together again. This piece is also nice and long for you, so it's not too hard to line up. And I'll go ahead and make sure that it dangles past both sides of my paper a little bit. Take it to my machine. I'm going to sew along B5. Now in this case, B5 doesn't go all the way to the top edge of my block, so I can just do my normal go a little bit past to get into the next seam allowance, but down here it does go all the way to the side, so I need to make sure that I'm sewing past my 1/4 inch seam, which is the dotted line around the outside of here. So this is what it looks like when it's sewn. Started up here and back stitched, ended down here and back stitched, just sewed right along that B5 line. I can press this, and then I'm ready for my very last piece. So my very last piece is B6, and same idea. Now I have 3 different lines of stitching that are going to be in the way of my fold, so I'll just pull the paper away from each of those. Why that back stitching is so important. You don't want to tug those stitches out of your actual fabric. Fold along B6, use my add a 1/4 ruler to give myself a nice straight line to match my last piece with. So I'll flip this over, take my last piece right sides together along the line that I just cut, and then go back to the printed side, and I'm going to sew along this line at my machine. So final line is sewn, started down here, came across the B6 line and ended once again outside that dotted 1/4 inch. I will press my final piece. And all that's left now is to trim this. We do have this dotted 1/4 inch line that makes it really easy to see where you want to trim, but I still recommend using the actual measurements on the ruler itself. That might end up being just ever so slightly different than cutting directly on this line because we've messed with this paper quite a bit at this point. So I've said in our pattern that we want to trim our finished flame to 1.5 inches by 3 inches. And I know that that's going to be roughly on these lines, so that's where I'm going to start. I have my 3 inches and my 1.5 inches, but I want to go ahead and make sure, rather than counting on the line itself, I'm just going to center this guy so that my ruler is roughly even around that dotted line. And it basically lines up. It's just ever so slightly different. So I will trim 2 sides. And now here's where we really want to use the ruler. When I flip this around, I'm not going to worry about these 2 lines so much because I've already gotten this side nice and square. I'm just going to use my 3-inch line and my 1.5-inch line on my ruler and trim from there. And what you'll see when I hold this up is that there's just the tiniest hint of that dotted line still left on the paper. And I made sure that everything was exactly the right size because I used the ruler. Right, this is what it looks like on the other side once it's been trimmed. And at this point it's ready to go. All we need to do is pull off all these little bits of paper. And that's nice and easy to do because we used a short stitch length. So when you're sewing this, you want to set your machine to a 1.5 stitch length, which is shorter than what you would normally use, but it makes it so the paper is nice and perforated and you can get it off at this stage without tugging really hard on all of your stitches. Some people find it helpful to use a little pair of tweezers with some of the smaller pieces that are in here. So if you're having a little bit of trouble, that's always a helpful tool. And don't worry about it if you have very tiny shreds of paper that are left that are kind of stuck underneath your stitches. Those aren't going to hurt anything in your final quilt. We just want to get all of the main pieces out. So you can see I've got just a couple little hairs of paper, for lack of a better word, that are in there. Those will just dissolve when your quilt gets washed. They won't ever hurt anything. And there's the front of your flame. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this is helpful, and happy sewing!